Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Byington, and this is another video on Anne Askew. This time we're talking about her testimony and her ballad, which she sang in Newgate. This is an engraving, a picture from John Fox's Acts and Monuments, which you also hear referred to as the Book of Martyrs, and this is the one that features Anne Askew. So this is her burning at the stake with the other prisoners, the other alleged criminals, as they would have been referred to then, in Smithfield Market. Now, the testimony, it's also often published as the first examination of Anne Askew that eventually led to that. Involves some points that she makes. If you read the testimony or the first examination of Askew in John Fox's Book of Martyrs or Acts and Monuments, the the sort of commentary by John Bell is excluded. If you read, like if you're a student in my class and you use the reading link for the PDF of Askew's first examination that I provide, that one includes a commentary by John Bell of these points throughout that I'm going to highlight three in particular from the examination. But John Bell's commentary I usually don't discuss because he kind of describes her as being weak. And it's like, dude, she was one of the only two women in history, allegedly, or as recorded, tortured on the rack. She was so severely tortured, she was unable to walk to her own execution because they had dislocated her shoulders, elbows, and hips. Um, so even though other male martyrs were underwent the same thing as Askew. John Bell like has praise for them, but Askew, who totally pretty much prevented Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife, from being executed, from being persecuted for Protestant beliefs. John Bell just kind of doesn't necessarily support Askew. So I just focus on Askew. So probably the most important point or points that she has in her testimony is her second and third point. And this was the most interesting because I think when people talk about theology, religious studies, this is a really major point, that of a physical place of worship. Like, what is the role of that space? What is it supposed to provide to one's faith? And I mean, you can look at that through a lens of not even just Christianity. You know, we're talking about that because we're talking about Askew, but even in other senses of spirituality, like what is the role of the space if we're talking about meditation, prayer, etc. In Askew's belief, she says that attending a physical church, a service, a mass, whatever you want to label it, if we're starting to look at this through the lens of different branches of Christianity to look at it from like a 21st century perspective, um, that doesn't promise any kind of saving. That doesn't mean you're going to go to heaven just because you went to church. It's what people do with that, like how they apply good to their life from that. But as you know, sometimes there are people who are, Puritan in public and pervert in private, and they act like this is a major part of their identity by being a quote unquote churchgoer, but they may not, in fact, be all that good of a person. They might not be living a very Christ like kind of life in their daily practices and uh, the love thy neighbor kind of sense. So Askew is like, well, I don't like hypocrites, basically. She says that going there, there's no point. That I had rather read 5 lines in the Bible on my own and miss 5 church services, she says, than hear 5 masses in the temple. Because she says it's about the individual reading and understanding and having some kind of their personal relationship with God than someone else mediating that, like the priest being the middleman. Okay, similarly, um, her fourth point is that if if the sermon, the person giving the sermon is not holy, so kind of again, like the phrase I just used, Puritan in public and pervert in private, um, that, well, does that make it pointless? Is there any point in hearing it? She says, well, um, yes and no, but if you were listening and you're still taking in, listening to the scripture, that person's problems are between them and God. So you kind of see the pattern here of this is all about the individual's direct relationship with God. This is not about the middle person, the priest, being in control of that. So she says, well, maybe they are a bad person and they do corrupt things as a church member or as a member of the clergy, like a priest. But if that person who's receiving that is listening and it changes the good that they put into the world or increases the good they put into the world, makes them a better person, then they are still technically receiving the body and the blood of Christ. That's from her explanation of that. Okay. And also, again, talking about mass. She says in her eighth point that this obsession with the need to attend mass and then a sort of private mass or prayer, action of prayer for souls, like praying for someone. If you are praying extensively for someone else, that this becomes a kind of form of idolatry. And it kind of defeats the purpose of that person having their relationship with God and asking for forgiveness about whatever the things they are doing. Okay, so to wrap that up, everything you read about Anne Askew's beliefs, you might see variations of that in different types of religious practices now, but what she is saying is totally radical for the 1500s, and especially for a woman to be defiant in this way and go out and say this, to be gospeling in the streets of London these beliefs. Okay, the other extant material we have about Anne Askew and her beliefs is this, which is called the Ballad, which Anne Askew made and sang when she was in Newgate. Newgate, referring to a prison. So this is the first time she's locked up, 1545. And that was March of 1545. So it's about a year and 3 months later when she's arrested that last time that leads to her torture and execution. So in Newgate prison, it's alleged that she sang this. That's why it's called a ballad. And so we have a type of transcription going on. And I also feel like this is a good time for me to point out that this that you're reading, this kind of secondhand information of someone having transcribed the ballad, like, do we know that for a fact Anne Askew was singing this or that she wrote it? Or when John Fox is praising her as a martyr, like how much of that is true? Who had this transcription of her first examination and her testimony? Where did this come from? Who got a hold of it? Because it would have been heresy. It would have been blasphemous to possess something like that at the time. You would have been burned at the stake because it would have looked like you were supporting Protestants. So, in her ballad, we have, just like all those things I just mentioned, this kind of posthumous celebration of her as a martyr, as a hero. So it is very appropriate to still have some speculation, some questions about, well, how much of this really came from her. I mean, she's totally a real person, and these things definitely happened to her. It's just that it all kind of comes from a collective of fragmented accounts of her life and the things she did, the documentations of her arrest, and the very real documentation of her torture in the Tower of London. But as far as these being her exact words, we cannot say for sure, but we still study it as part of extant and Askew material. Okay, so to kind of summarize what's going on in this ballad of Anne Askew, she is essentially discussing her faith as a kind of shield. First, she describes it as a shield in these four lines that I have here in the second bullet point. So she describes herself as a warrior who's fighting against the world with her faith. First, her faith is a shield. So, like as the armed knight appointed to the field, with this world will I fight, and faith will be my shield. So, think about this. First, it's just defense. But then, in that next stanza, she goes on to describe her faith as a weapon. So she says, so we're moving from defensive to offensive. So now she's using it as a weapon to fight against these people who are coming after her, interrogating her. And the really nice thing about this in the end, in these last lines in the final bullet point I have here, she says, yet, Lord, I thee desire, for that they do to me, let them not taste the hire of their iniquity. So she's practicing forgiveness and acceptance. She is not saying she hopes they suffer. She hopes that someday they know how they experience the pain they're putting her through. She is just saying that she doesn't want this to happen to them, that this is a type of forgiveness. She's not seeking revenge. Okay, so that wraps up Anne Askew's material here. Thank you for watching.